so you might.
Lord will be here.
Yes. Usually add a few. So the stool is very wobbly this morning. I'm gonna sit here and wobble. I'm gonna just sit here and rock all day. Anyway, good morning. Shabbat shalom. So this week's portion, as all of them are, is kind of interesting. It is the life of Sarah, which is actually the end of her life. I think it's funny sometimes that they like name sections off of like the end of it, and the portions are named for like what happens at the beginning of the portion. Usually the beginning, the first couple of words, which is why it's called Sarah's life.
Kind of like TV episodes.
Yes, yes. I know. I've been noticing that. I've been watching old seasons of The Amazing Race.
Yeah.
And it's always really funny to see the episode titles. They pull like some really random quote from the episode, and it like cracks me up. So I'm so sometimes like, I'll see the name of the episode. I'm like, I wonder what's going to happen that made somebody say that. Anyway. So the life of Sarah. And then of course we have, in this portion, we also have this whole issue that Isaac needs a wife. So Abraham's servant goes and finds Rebekah. And then at the end of the portion, we have the end of Abraham's life. So we have lots of things going on, as usual. So we have slowed down a little bit. We're not like going through like hundreds of years or thousands of years in one portion. At this point, we get to stay with the same people. But what I noticed about this portion, as I was reading through, was that I felt like it kind of reiterated the Abrahamic Covenant again. And so kind of like we've talked about, the Abrahamic Covenant has 3 parts to it. Anybody remember what they are?
No.
Blessing, seed, and land.
Yes, exactly. Very good. Yes. So, yes, because we have several times where God tells Abraham, I'm going to give you, I'm going to make you a father of nations, and, I'll bless your seed, and then he promises that his descendants are going to inherit the promised land. And then we have this whole, whoever blesses you will be blessed, whoever curses you will be cursed, is kind of that's the summary of the Abrahamic Covenant. So as I was reading through, I was actually kind of seeing some of those themes kind of revisited and reiterated. We're seeing some progression in some of those things in some small ways. So that's kind of the lens that we're going to look at this through this morning. So we're going to kind of just take it chapter by chapter because it kind of works out that way. So in chapter 23, kind of just the summary again, this is the end of Sarah's life. She lived to be 127 years old. And that is significant because, for a couple of reasons. One is God says back in Genesis 6, I believe, it's in somewhere in the Noah story, that the lifespan of humanity will be 120 years. And so she bypassed that. And we have other people who go past it, but the 120 years is kind of the fullness of life. The idea of fullness of life, we know at the very end of the Torah that Moses lived to be 120 years old. But then she's 127 years, and some of the commentators say that is significant because 7 is also kind of this completion, fullness kind of number as well. So they're just saying it's significant that she was a significant person. She's also the only woman in the Torah that we get her age at the time that she dies. So there's a lot of mystery to that, and I don't know what we make of all of that, but it seems that she's a significant person, which of course we know she's kind of the first of the matriarchs in the Jewish, even Shabbat blessings, when fathers bless their daughters, they say, and may you be like Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Rachel. And so she's kind of the first one. She's the mother of the nations. So course you guys know those things, but just reiterating that she is a significant person, and so it's the Torah is kind of highlighting that by giving us more details about her, even her death, than we would often get about women. She does die in the land of Canaan. So she dies in the promised land, which of course kind of becomes the issue here, because Abraham is living there. He of course had gone down to Egypt. He's come back. But they don't own it, right? The promise of the land has been given, but it's not yet full ownership and full, there's other people living there, and Abraham and his family are still kind of guests in the land at this point. And so he has now this issue that Sarah has died, and he wants to bury her, right? And so he goes to and speaks with the natives, I guess you could say, and says, hey, I want to buy some land to bury my wife. And they're like, oh, just take it. He's got some honor, they recognize him as being from the Lord, and they're like, no one's going to withhold land from you. Go right on ahead, take the land that you want, and bury your wife. And Abraham's like, no, I want to buy it from you. So why is he so adamant that he buy the land and not just say, oh, thank you, you're being so kind. I appreciate your generosity. Why is he so adamant that he buy the land to bury Sarah?
I think it would be because that way they can't come back to him later and say, hey, you know what, this is our land, we just loaned it to you or whatever. And by buying it, it's purchased with a price. There's a price that's been paid for it. Yeshua purchased our salvation with his blood and his death and resurrection. So I kind of look at it that way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I look at it also as it's, since he purchased it, there is like a right to that land.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly.
Rather than being gifted, he's actually kind of like in the same way Jeremiah goes and buys that property, so that when he comes, it seemed really foolish to buy land when you're going to be exiled. But again, this ownership that you can keep coming back to it, because I bought this, and he didn't even let him sell it to him at a reduced price. It was like the full price. And this is now the stamp that gives legitimacy to Abraham, to burials there, to whatever. There's a legitimacy there now.
Right. Yeah, I think both of those are the two kind of main things. He doesn't want it contested later. He doesn't want the descendants of those people to go back on the word and say, no, you can't have this anymore. You can't, it's not yours. We're taking it back. And also, it's kind of this, I like how Dennis Prager kind of calls it a token title. It's kind of the first piece of land within the Promised Land that's actually owned. And so it's this kind of like symbolic, this is mine now. We have, we have a more permanent tie to the land. So of course Sarah is the first to be buried there, and then there's others that end up being buried there later. And I believe I can't remember. I think it's Jacob says, because of course Jacob dies in Egypt, but I think it's Jacob that says he wants them to take, when they go back to the land, they want him to take and bury him at Machpelah, which is the name of the cave where they bury Sarah. And this piece of land, it's so interesting that this is the first piece of land that's owned, and within Israel, it's one of the most contested pieces of land still today. There's lots of fighting. If I remember correctly, and I meant to look this up and I forgot to do it. So if you look it up and I'm wrong, don't come after me, because I'm saying that I might be wrong. But I believe it's kind of out in the territories. Like it's in the contested area, and so it it's just interesting that it kind of breeds that. And of course, because of the ties back to Abraham and Sarah, of course there's a lot of Arab claim to it as well. And so it's interesting that this is the first piece of land that's owned that is still very contested today. So anyway, but this is kind of this land piece. So like I was saying, I feel like this portion is kind of reiterating these themes of the Abrahamic Covenant. So we have this land piece. So now, again, they're still not full owners of the land, but they own a piece of it. And even just a piece of, for burial even, is kind of significant. So here's a question, and I don't know that I have a definitive answer, so I'm curious what you guys think about this. So at the beginning of chapter 23, when it talks about Sarah dying, it says that Abraham came to mourn Sarah, and to weep over her. So do you think that Abraham was with Sarah when she died?
Because of the word came?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Would have said so, I think.
Yeah, and it's like,
Came to mourn.
yeah.
Came to mourn.
He came
So
to
does
mourn.
that mean he was somewhere and came, or that he brought himself to a point of mourning? Because came can have.
Exactly. That is the question. And I don't know, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say a lot of translations use went,
Mm-hmm.
so that would seem to imply that it was like the verb to go and not like he came into a state of mourning.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
What's the Hebrew word there? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I don't know exactly what the Hebrew is, but the Hebrew, is came or went, and so it depends on the Hebrew verbs. And I didn't look up the Hebrew word, and I didn't look at the conjugation of it, and so it depends on a little bit what form it's in. But yeah, like Prager's translation, he's proceeded to mourn for Sarah, and so it's some different So the question is, did he kind of enter into a state of mourning, or did he physically have to come from a different location? So, and I don't know that I fully realize this. So there are many who think that particularly because of the binding of Isaac, Sarah was not very happy about that. And so they were certainly still married. They certainly were still together, but that maybe she kind of had her own life a little bit after the whole incident of the binding of Isaac, because she was not very happy about that. Is one theory that floats around that I hadn't really thought about. So I'm not making definitive remarks about this. I'm just throwing out some theories that Abraham, and I think she was still very important to Abraham. I'm not saying that, I just think that, which I can imagine a mother that you might not be very happy when your husband takes your 13-year-old son up a mountain to kill him. Like, you just might not like that very much. Even though he comes back. It's all fine. But that's, I think there's complicated. I'm not saying that's necessarily what happened. I think it's possible that maybe he was on a trip. Maybe it was just this entering into this state of mourning. I'm not sure, but it's interesting to look at some of these different ideas.
Well, and she was 127 years old, so
Right.
I'm gonna guess that she probably hung around the tent a lot.
Yeah.
And he probably was out with the amount of land
Mhm.
and being a shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
He could have been off grazing in this area, like let's move the
Mhm.
animals over to here. So she's probably, like I said, 127 years old, so she's probably not out there herding sheep or anything.
Right,
So she's
right.
probably-
Yeah, if he was either.
Yeah,
Right.
well,
Right.
so, and I also find later, it says when, Isaac brought his wife back to his mother's tent,
Mhm.
which leads me to believe that she had a separate tent from her husband.
Yeah, it's very possible. And later on in this portion too, we're going to see that Abraham has another wife, which has some interesting things about it.
Mhm.
And so which was common at the time, like that was common practice. Yeah.
It's both. It's come in, go,
Yeah.
go out.
Yeah. So yeah, it can mean come in or go out. It can, both can appear in several different forms, and they slightly, but yeah. So that would be, it would signify physical movement, but though, so that's helpful. Yeah.
Well, and it does seem like that when they died, not always, but they just died.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't, like we get sick and die.
Right.
It doesn't seem, because I've read of other people, they don't necessarily, it says they grow old.
Right.
And die, so you don't really know, because I'm thinking, well, if she was sick,
Right.
would he be there?
Right.
But it doesn't say she was sick.
Right. It doesn't say she wasn't. So I
Right.
don't know. Again.
But often.
Sorry
it
if I'm
doesn't
stirring
know.
up more questions than
I know,
right?
We don't
But that's
know.
the nature of the Torah. I know, but
So Emma, how old is Abraham at this point? Do we
so
know?
Abraham was I believe 10 years older than Sarah, because I think
Yeah.
when they go through this whole year, when God comes and promises him a son, I think Sarah was 90 and he was 100 or something like that.
I can't imagine him being that work in the fields.
Yeah, I don't know that he was. I don't know. We don't know. So, I mean, but even if they were living in generally the same location, they may have had separate tents. And again, he apparently had at least one other wife. And so, we don't know all of this, but it's interesting to think about what that dynamic might have been. Not that it necessarily plays into how we read this story, but just, I thought that was kind of interesting. I hadn't really thought about that fully before, so just throwing that out there to add more questions to your list. Okay, so back to this issue about the land. So, and this was an interesting thing. So we talked about, Laura brought up that when we were talking about the significance of buying the land versus just taking it when it's offered. And it's interesting because it does say, well, one, this happens in public. There's a couple different mentions where, they're kind of in the presence of these other Hittite people. Like there's other people who are hearing this transaction go down, which helps with the issue of it being questioned later. And then I was looking for the verse where it says, where it gives the price. Maybe it's later. Yeah, 400 shekels of silver. And it kind of is interesting because, this native person that he's dealing with, who is, I don't know if we know if he's a king or not, I can't remember now. But Ephron, he's like, the land is worth 400 shekels. What's that between you and me? As if that's a small price. It was actually a very large price, and signifies, Abraham, of course, was very wealthy. He had started to gain a lot of wealth, and so it's interesting that they kind of talk about like this is nothing, but it was actually a very high price. But Abraham is still insistent on buying the land, and I thought this was really interesting because again we talked about this is land that's promised to Abraham, and so in some sense it would make sense for him to just take it and lay his claim and say, no, God said this is mine, I'm taking it. But I thought this was an interesting perspective from Dennis Prager, because he was talking about Abraham having kind of this high level of morality and kind of being honest in his dealings, and how significant that was. And there's actually several examples of strong character throughout this portion that we'll continue to talk about. But this is what he said about kind of Abraham and his insistence on buying the land instead of just taking it. He says, even if God makes promises, humans may need to act to realize them, and do so legally and morally. Having God on one side does not allow a person or a group either to do nothing or act improperly. On the contrary, it is precisely those who claim God's providence who must act particularly decently. They have to earn the moral right to have God on their side by behaving as if they are on God's side. Yeah. So I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective, and a kind of, this another way of seeing Abraham was very honorable in how he was dealing with this situation. And I liked the point that highlighted of this strong character that, he couldn't just take the land because God said, well, if God said it's mine, so I'm going to take it. He still dealt, he has an element of humility of saying, these people actually own this land right now, and so I'm going to deal with them honorably. So even though it's still contested land, it was purchased properly and honorably, and honor and all those words that I can't say right now.
Well, it comes back to relationship again and partnership with God.
Right.
And not just saying, okay, thanks.
Right. Yeah, and it's even like, whereas in other instances we see Abraham or others kind of try to force the hand of God of trying to like make it happen, even Isaac, or even Abraham with the whole situation with Ishmael, he's kind of trying to force the promise a little bit. In this case, he's like, it seemed, to me it looks like a little bit more like he's being more patient. He's like, God said this is going to belong to my family, but it's not yet, so I'm going to deal with it based on the rules that are kind of in place right now. Did you have something, Laura?
Yeah, it used to bother me when I would read these sections about them bickering back and forth about prices, and it's all over the word. There's even Abraham with God just doing this back and forth thing. And as I've grown to learn more about Arab culture and Jewish culture, it's a very almost honoring thing in a sense.
Mhm.
It's this cultural norm
Yeah.
for them, and there's nothing like wrong. The arguments and the way that it's how they come into respecting each other.
Mhm.
It's a very different way than Western thinking, and
Yes.
Americans who don't like to argue.
Right.
We
Particularly
don't like
Midwesterners,
conflict.
right?
Yeah.
Midwestern kindness. Oh, no, you go ahead.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that in there, because without that in there, we wouldn't understand the
Right.
cultural context within which everything in the scriptures takes place, including Yeshua's life and death and how all that even came, and his interactions with John, his own cousin, and you think of them as very proper, but all of a sudden you realize, no, they probably were very Jewish.
Right. Very much so. Yeah, I think it's really true. I think, there's a lot of, everything's a negotiation.
Yeah, that's
You're not really taking fruit from the mouths of my children.
Right. Okay. So let's move on. So let's look at chapter 24. So this, of course, is, the TLB titles this chapter, The Courting of Rebecca. So the issue at hand in this chapter is Isaac needs a wife, right? So again, looking at our kind of three parts of the Abrahamic Covenant, this has to do with the seed, right? Isaac needs a wife because the line needs to continue. So at this point, somewhere in here it tells us Isaac is 40 years old and he's not married. So I don't know at that time exactly, because they did live longer still, but of course lifetimes are shorter. So with the maximum of 120 years, or in Sarah's case 127. But he doesn't seem to be in such a hurry if he's 40 years old and not married. And so Abraham is, and at this point now we're talking about that Abraham is old, and he's kind of, it kind of sets this up as, before he dies, he's got to make sure that Isaac's taken care of. And so, interestingly enough, this is also the longest chapter in Genesis, and it's about this whole issue of Isaac getting married, so that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of detail given in this marriage transaction, which of course we have other marriages that are detailed quite extensively, but this one seems to be especially significant and detailed. So of course Abraham is going to send out his servant. Many understand this to be Eliezer, but it doesn't name him, so we don't know that for sure, but I don't think it's a problem to think that it's Eliezer. And he sends him to go find a wife for Isaac from the land of Abraham's birth and not from the Canaanites. Why would Abraham be so adamant that Isaac not marry from the Canaanites?
Well, the land that he's dwelling in, if he married a Canaanite, then you've got the joint ownership there for the land part. And so in my mind, in order for the promise to be to Abraham's family, then Abraham's son should be pulling from that family line and not from what ends up actually being one of their enemies
Right.
down the line.
Right.
So I think that was the importance of it. I also found it really fascinating that when Abraham set this off, and it said to him, when he said, that the servant said, suppose the woman were unwilling to follow me back to this land, should I then have your son go back to the land you came from? And it's like that constant, okay, let's go back. And he was like twice adamant on, he wanted a wife from this land, but do not let my son go
Right.
backwards. We need to keep moving forward.
Exactly. Yeah, isn't that interesting? And it's like, I don't know, it's kind of those are interesting questions to ponder too, and of course we don't have any more detail than what is given here, just that Abraham's so adamant about it. Because yeah, so I think you're right with the issue of marrying a Canaanite is then you have some issues with ownership, and also because, and this gets a little bit gray and complicated, but I mean the Canaanites, it seems like they had a decent relationship while they were living there. It seems like everybody's getting along okay at this point, but obviously that's not going to be the case in the future. But everybody's kind of getting along right now, so it's kind of a little bit like, I don't know why this is such a big deal, but it does seem that maybe there's enough kind of misalignment of values and of lifestyle and of all these things that it would be problematic for Isaac to marry from the Canaanites. And also with the issue of not sending Isaac back to the land he came from is interesting too, because it's like, well, because on the one hand, I could argue, is it so bad if he goes back and meets the rest of his family, which he probably hasn't met, but then would he want to stay? But then would he, because he's living in the land, and Isaac is actually the only one of the patriarchs who lives his entire life in the land. Because of course Abraham was called there, and then goes in and out a little bit, and then Jacob, of course, starts out there, but then ends up in Egypt. And so Isaac is the only one of the patriarchs who lives his entire life in the Promised Land. And it seems that, I don't know if Abraham knew how important that was at this point, and maybe he did, maybe because it seems like, because even when you get to the narrative of Jacob, when Jacob's going to go down to Egypt, there's this wrestle about leaving the land. So they do seem to have this emphasis that it's important to stay there. So I don't know if that's just the case, or it's just once you leave, it's hard to come back. Of course, travel is very dangerous and expensive in the ancient world. There's all these things that come into play. But nevertheless, it's important for Abraham. You have these 2 points of tension. He must marry someone from the land that I came from, but he's not to go there. So it becomes very important that this servant is successful in going and finding the right person, and that she agrees to come. Which was an interesting nuance, because we know, of course, in antiquity, women didn't get a lot of choice about who they married. But here at the beginning, and later on when the servant is actually talking with Rebecca's family, there is this question of, will she agree to go? And so it does seem that, she may not have had much choice about who she married, but she did have somewhat of a choice of leaving her family. It's one thing to not have a choice who you marry, but marry within your tribe or within your land, and you're still, down the road from your family. It's another thing to go and say, no, you actually have to leave and go to an entirely different land. You're probably never going to see your family again. So it does seem that she had some choice in that, which is also very interesting, and not really, kind of the normal situation. And it also shows, some of this even respect for her as a woman, which is something that we do actually see quite a bit in Torah, the way that that the Israelites treat women more fairly than many of their neighboring tribes and people. Okay, so I'm going to read. I want to read this little section where Abraham is kind of commissioning this servant to go out, and then we'll actually talk through some of what happens once he goes.
I have a question about verse 2.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any insight on the putting the hand under the thigh and what that means?
Yes. It was a very intimate moment for them. That was how they made contracts then.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes.
Is that a normal?
Yes,
Okay.
that was an ancient tradition of making a contract.
Okay.
Dennis Prager in his commentary is funny. He's like, now we shake hands. She's like, I much prefer that. It was very funny.
Okay, thank you.
But yes, this is making a contract. So it's kind of, it's I don't know that I would say it's quite covenantal, but it's a very serious, there would be serious consequences for not carrying out the contract that's being made.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. so let's actually just kind of pick up there. So in verse 2, when Abraham starts speaking to the servant, he says, Now put your hand under my thigh, so I may make with you an oath by Adonai, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from among the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am dwelling. On the contrary, to my land and to my relatives you must go and get a wife for my son Isaac. But the servant said to him, Suppose the woman were unwilling to follow me, follow after me to this land. Should I then have your son go back to the land you came from? Abraham said to him, See to it that you don't return my son there. Adonai, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my native land, and who spoke to me and made a pledge to me, saying, To your seed I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. If the woman is not willing to follow after you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Nevertheless, you must not return my son there. So they carry this out, and the servant leaves. And so the significance of what Abraham is saying is that he's calling on the name of Adonai, the God of heaven and the God of earth. So this is, he is attributing this decision and the significance of this to God. And he again is quoting from, the covenantal language about the land and the seed. And interestingly, he says that he tells the servant that Adonai will send an angel before him, but we don't ever hear mention of an angel later on in the story. So it's interesting to think about what that means. Either it was, you could look at it that, because Rebecca was the one that was there, it was, a God-appointed interaction, which is very possible. I have no problems with that interpretation, but we never have mention of an angel showing up that the servant recognizes. And so it's interesting that that's what's promised, but then we don't have an actual record of what that means. So I don't know what to make of that, but that's what he says. Okay. And God is, and I think Abraham kind of attributes all this wealth that he's accumulated to the provision of God, and that, God's blessing him, and, of course we have this land and seed, so all these things. So keep that in mind as we go on. So servant goes out, and he is kind of trying to figure out, because notice, Abraham doesn't tell this servant exactly how he's supposed to know who the right person is. He doesn't give a list of attributes. He doesn't give, he doesn't give him much instruction. He just says, go find someone. So clearly there's a lot of trust. And also it's just, so maybe that is, also Abraham's faith of trusting that God is going to provide the right person. So anyway, the servant goes out, and in verse 12, we have a very interesting little interaction. The servant is saying, Adonai, the God of Abraham, my master, please make something happen before me today and show loyalty to Abraham, my master. And then he goes in and he kind of is basically talking to God about what he's going to do and how he's going to know it's the right person. So this is actually the first instance where we have a kind of a personal petition to the Lord. This is like our first, we have other, of course, Abraham's talking to God previously. We have other instances of talking to God. It's often on behalf of other people or often in this very covenantal way. But this is kind of our first record of just an individual going to the Lord and saying, hey, I need you to help me here. So it's even, which is even kind of just this, it kind of just slides right in there. It's this little nugget that anybody can approach the Lord, anybody can petition the Lord, even from the beginning, which is kind of cool.
Do you also find it interesting that he doesn't say Adonai, my God, but he refers to him as the God of Abraham?
Mm-hmm. It is interesting. So there's not this personal understanding yet, even though he is personally petitioning the Lord. But yeah, there's not this like fully personal relationship understanding.
That's kind of like the very first time that you hear the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but this time it's the God of Abraham.
Right.
Like that kind of starts that prayer phrase of the God of. And so I found that kind of interesting because I think this is the first person that's referred to the God of Abraham.
Yeah. And at this point, I think, also, you know, of course they are still living in a very polytheistic world. We don't know the background, like we're saying, we think it might be Eliezer, we don't know for sure. So we don't know the background of this servant, what land or people, so servant and slave are interchangeable in the Old Testament. I like that TLD uses servant because it makes our modern selves less like, oh, like it makes us cringe less. And I think it's accurate because, and Tom does a really good job teaching about slavery. We're not going to go all the way down that rabbit trail, but the idea is that, I mean, they had a relationship clearly, and there's a lot of trust, and there's, you know, they were like family, really. It wasn't the, you know, the African slave trade type of slavery that we think of when we hear the word slave, which is, I think, why TLD uses servant, which is an accurate translation as well. Yeah.
I think there's another perspective about saying Abraham, or, you know, God, Adonai, you are the God of Abraham. There's a showing of respect and honoring, and he is a servant, but I don't think we can say he doesn't have a personal relationship, because I know as a prayer person, there are many times I have asked the Lord, for my husband, for instance, things that he was dealing with. Lord, you are his Lord, you are his God, would you speak to him or show him or whatever. So I think it shows not necessarily a lack of personal for himself, we can't really say.
Sure.
But there is that other aspect of he is saying, I am submitted to Abraham, this is what Abraham wants, I'm serving Abraham, will you please show me?
Right.
And I think that's under authority thing, it could be also.
Yeah, I mean, and he is out on an assignment from Abraham.
Right.
And so calling on God and on kind of in the name of Abraham, I guess you could kind of say, makes sense also because he is on an errand. And so there's kind of both and. There's kind of this, like, you know, he refers to him as the God of Abraham, which, like we're saying, there could be a couple different reasons for, but at the same time, he's still doing it. So he does at least have some understanding that he has the right and ability to petition God himself. Not going through a priest, not going through Abraham specifically, you know, even though it's in the name of Abraham, but, you know, there is, like, so there's kind of this both and. It's kind of, he does have this understanding that he can personally ask, but then there's these other situations that.
And not just ask, but get an answer.
Right.
Which is really cool.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually thinking that maybe it had something to do also with saying, like, you're the God of Abraham, so you're the one who, like, promised Abraham a son and he got it. You're the one who did X, Y, Z, and was, like, faithful to your word.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, it's kind of calling God to faithfulness in some sense. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think.
Were there any other examples of the father choosing a wife for his son? I mean, I know a lot of his the woman didn't get a choice, but in all the other examples I can think of, it was the man that went out to find his wife. He made that choice. In this case, it's Abraham doing it. Why?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that we fully know, other than it seems that, you know, it kind of, and I think, let me see what it says here. Isaac, I mean, we don't have a lot of information about Isaac's involvement, which many take to mean he doesn't have a whole lot of interest.
Yeah, that's what
But then again, Abraham didn't want him to go back to the land to pick a wife too. So that might have something to do with it. Also, is you're in this land, you don't get any of these women. At this point in time, because Sarah had died, and obviously, like we see at the end of that portion, that he took Rebecca to his mother's tent. And there he was comforted from the loss of his mom. So I think he obviously, it sounds like he had been grieving the loss of his mom. His dad's getting ready to die. The concubine's siblings are all going to be sent away. I mean, I kind of started like looking at this like, this is really a lonely guy.
Yeah.
If he goes back to that land where he actually has comfort from family.
Right.
So I think Abraham is trying to really make sure that what he has established continues on, and Isaac has to stay put. Cause that would be like, you know, even when you lose somebody, family gathers together for comfort. He's not gonna have that. He's not gonna have siblings, he's not gonna have anything but him and Rebecca.
Right, and I think, so I think that's part of it. It seems like there is a level of control from Abraham in this particular situation. But at the same time, we also don't have Isaac coming and arguing with him. We don't know that didn't happen. We may just not have the record of that.
Yeah.
You know, we only have what we have. But as far as your question, Stan, of like whether this happens, I think it does. I don't know that I have specifics off the top of my head, but I think there's other instances where the father is more involved in choosing for the son.
Okay.
I would have to go look and find some of those, but like I'm even thinking about like, well, that's the verse a little bit, but even like, I mean, I'm thinking about the Judah and Tamar story. When Judah's sons die, and he keeps making the sons marry her, which is, I mean, also a customary thing because he's responsible for taking care of her, so that's a little bit of a different situation. But I don't know that it was out of the question that a father would be choosing, because they are often, you know, somewhat business transactions. You know, they're making, you know, there's usually animals and things changing hands with marriages, and so I think there's a lot of family input on both sides to marriages at this time.
It was on for a very long time. I mean, they were still doing that in the 69, 70?
Right. Well, it talks about later, I thought this was funny too in Dennis Prager's commentary, because at the end of the portion, you know, when Rebecca comes back and they get married, it says that Isaac loved her, that they got married and he loved her, which is only the second instance of love that's mentioned in the Torah so far. And it's mentioned like, oh, he happened to love her. It's like, well, great. So glad this man loves his wife.
Yeah.
Well,
But
she was beautiful, and she watered his camels. What's not
And she must have been somewhat attracted to him because she fell off her camel when she saw him. So,
Yes.
which just cracks me up every time. But
But you're right, it does seem like it was more business transactions in a way. Probably because of land and sea.
Yes.
And those important things, and the emotion was definitely not high on the list.
Yeah, it
If
wasn't.
it came, that was great.
Right, because even we see that later with Jacob, with the whole issue with, you know, with him having to work, and the whole issue with Rachel and Leah, and, you know, all the things that happened in that. Like, there was, I mean, it's, in that sense, it's almost like love made it more complicated.
Yeah.
Like, if he hadn't loved either one of them, it probably would have been easier.
Yes.
But, but I thought it was funny, Dennis Prager brought up even Fiddler on the Roof, if you guys have seen Fiddler on the Roof, and they have this whole scene, because the whole disruption of the family is that his daughters want to marry the people they love instead of who he's picking for them. Yeah. And so then Tevye and Golda have this interaction of, do you love me? And they're like, I'm your wife. Do you love me? Well, we've been married for 25 years. But do you love me? And finally they're like, well, I guess so. Great. So glad. But, you know, that's, you know, obviously, like you're saying, much more recent history. And of course, it's fictional, but it's still representing the time frame. And so you have a lot of this, and at that point, it was still revolutionary for his daughters to want to marry for love, and he doesn't really approve of their choices, especially the one who wants to marry the Russian. But anyway, all that to say, yes, it was more businesslike, and I think that there was a lot of family agreement on both sides.
Interaction, a lot of family.
And a lot of business dealings, and a lot of this. Did you have something?
Yeah, well, just something you said tangentially. You said it was the second reference. Is the first one when about Abraham loving Isaac?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. I meant to go back to that, and I was going to forget. So the first reference of love that we have is as at the binding of Isaac, because it says.
Take your only son who you love.
Yeah, take your only son who you love, Isaac, and go to the land and offer him. And so then that's it, you know, the father-son love, and so now we have a husband-wife love that comes into play. Okay, so let's go back to the servant trying to find his wife. Okay, so basically the servant kind of has this plan of, I'm going to go to the well, and the woman who, I'm going to ask for a drink, and if she offers to water, gives me the drink and offers to water the camels, I know that's the one. So sure enough, that's exactly what happens, and he sees Rebecca. She gives him a drink, and then waters the camels, and so he gives her. So at that point, when she waters the camels, he doesn't know whose family she's part of yet, but he gives her these gifts, basically, this nose ring of gold and bracelets. So he gives her these gifts and wants to go back to her father's house. And at that point, he finds out who she is, and that she's actually a relative of Abraham. And so then they go back, and then we meet Laban. And so what is the first thing in verse, in verse 29 and 30, of 24, we meet Laban. And what is the first thing that Laban notices? Her nose ring. Yeah, he notices the gifts. He notices that she has been adorned with expensive gold. And he is immediately interested. And so, which, knowing what we know about Laban later, makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? But it's interesting that that's our introduction, is that we see Laban and he immediately notices the gold. So, and so of course then they go and they have this whole interaction about, to figure out if this is really going to work out. So here's what I want to point out here. I'm going to read a section of this that's a bit long, but I remember back when we read what Abraham told the servant before when he sent the servant about his reasoning and what he's asking him to do. And then let's look at what the servant says to Laban. And apparently her father, Bethuel, shows up at some point too, because at the end of this, he's there answering. So apparently he shows up somewhere along the way. Okay, so when they go back, this is the servant's kind of explanation. He says, starting in verse 34, I'm Abraham's servant. Adonai has blessed my master very much, so that he has become great, and he has given to him flocks and sheep and cattle, silver and gold, male slaves and female slaves, camels and donkeys. Now Sarah, my master's wife, gave birth to a son for my master after she was old, and he gave him everything he owns. Then my master made me take an oath, saying, you must not take a wife for my son from among the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I am dwelling. Instead, you must go to my father's house and to my family and take a wife for my son. But I said to my master, suppose the woman won't come back with me. So he said to me, Adonai, before whom I've walked continually, will send his angel with you, and he will make your way successful, and you will take a wife for my son from my family and from my father's household. Then you'll be free from my oath if you come to my family, and if they don't give her to you, then you'll be free from my oath. So I came today to the spring and I said, Adonai, the God of Abraham, my master, if you are really going to make my way upon which I am walking successful, look, I'm standing by a spring of water, so let it be that the unmarried girl who's going out to draw water, to whom I'll say, please give me a little water to drink from your jug, and she'll say to me, you drink, and I'll also draw water for your camels. Let her be the woman whom Adonai appoints for my master's son. I had not yet finished speaking to my heart, and behold, there was Rebekah going out. Her jug was on her shoulder, and she was going down to the spring and drew water. So I said to her, please give me a drink. And she quickly lowered her jug off her hand and said, drink, and I'll also water your camels. So I drank, and she also watered the camels. Then I asked her, whose daughter are you? And she said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. Then I placed a ring on her nose and the bracelets on her hands. I bowed down and worshipped Adonai and blessed Adonai, the God of my master Abraham, who guided me on the true way to take the daughter of my master's brother for his son. So now, if you're really going to show loyalty and truth to my master, tell me, but if not, tell me, and I'll turn to the right or to the left. Okay, so, did Abraham tell the servant that the girl had to be from his family? No. Okay, Did the servant give the nose ring and bracelets to Rebecca before or after he found out whose family she belonged to?
Before.
Before. But in the story he says he found out first and then gave it to her. So these could be inconsequential differences, but it's interesting that the servant is making such a point, because he says it several times, that Abraham told him it had to be from his father's house, and Abraham did not say that.
Is it implied because he's going back to the land? Would everyone there have been Abraham's family?
Possibly, but I mean, it seems like but I can't imagine that the people in the land, going back to his native land, I can't imagine that necessarily every person would have been his relative. I think it was, going back to the tribe, basically. Yeah. I think there's probably a high likelihood, because again, the way marriages and things worked, you're probably in some extended way related to a lot of people, but it wasn't specified. So it's interesting that then he's bringing that up. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm just going back, he says, but that you will go to my homeland, this is verse 4,
mm-hmm.
to my kinsmen. So kinsmen is relatives, right?
That's what I always thought.
Yes.
To choose a wife from it could
So
be.
it says to his kinsmen. Okay, so this is a good distinction. Sorry, I wasn't thinking about this clearly. So yeah, to his kinsmen, but the servant is saying that Abraham told him to go specifically to his father's house. So I think Abraham's instruction is, yes, within the family. So it could be a, seventh cousin.
Yeah,
He wasn't looking at, but the servant is kind of implying he told me to go specifically to my immediate family. And so because Laban's, it's a pretty close relationship. So I think if I remember, I think it would be like Laban's uncle or something was Abraham or something. I don't know. I might be getting that wrong. I feel like I'm not thinking about the genealogy correctly. But so yes, to the land of relatives and to the land of, but then he ends up being specifically within Abraham's immediate family line, which is not specifically what Abraham said. Doesn't necessarily mean, again, he could have been insinuating that, it could be implied, it could be all these things, but that's not the wording that Abraham used. He said to my relatives, whereas the servant is specifically saying from his father's household. And so it's a narrowing down, which is probably because of who Rebecca is, because he now knows the exact family connection that they have. And so again, there's some negotiation happening here, because it's a big ask for him to want to take her and leave and go to a different land and have her marry Isaac. And then also the other thing about this explanation, which this is a part that we skipped, but in this retelling he even says that he thanked Adonai for guiding him to this correct person, and that's what had happened even after he first encountered Rebecca. We have this that he bowed down and thanked. He had this gratitude for Adonai. So not only do we have this kind of first personal petition, but we also see this example of this thanksgiving when God has done what he asked, which is pretty great. So, okay. So Rebecca, a couple things about Rebecca. So it's interesting, yeah. So just to point out, there are some differences between what Abraham said, and also he does mention the name of Adonai, but he doesn't. He definitely is emphasizing Abraham's wealth and Abraham's, that this is a good situation, because he wants to be successful.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that he was being deceptive. I'm just saying that it's interesting that the servant kind of knows how he needs to lay this out for Laban, to be able to be successful in this ultimately, and that, yeah.
Well, it's kind of like, even though God showed up and did it, it's kind of like human nature to try to help it move along.
Right, exactly.
And Abraham made the mistake of trying to help along and stuff. So I think that's just kind of like human nature. Yeah, you see God do it, and God promised something, but as human beings, we feel like we have to step in and help God do it.
Right.
And so I think that's the expounding on this and
Right.
he was trying to help along what.
Right. Well, and I think it could also be, I wonder if it could also be like again, we have, he asked God to help him, and then God did, and he recognized that. So now I wonder if he's a little bit like, all right, I need to not screw this up.
Yeah.
Like, I need to, and he, and because we have this detail about Laban noticing the wealth, it seems that he's understanding, he's reading the situation that this is what's going to help him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was last Torah study, I watched it online, there was a comment about possibly Abraham's father might have been the one originally that God was dealing with, possibly, it's only possible, and for whatever reason, which isn't stated, Abraham is the one that God chose. Now that I'm realizing who Laban is, there's this character difference. Laban's, a lot of the people in that area that stayed there are business people there. I don't want to say they're materialistic, but they're which is a very actual Jewish trait is being really good at that. And Abraham, now that I'm thinking the whole Abrahamic story, you don't really hear a lot about, he's a businessman, he's great, but it's not emphasized. What's emphasized is his character and his adoration of God, and yet because of that, or part of that is the blessing that just gets heaped on Abraham. He's just got all this wealth, all this stuff, and yet the thing that the scriptures concentrate on is his character, his relationship with God. So you get to see this contrast of what is the focus in each part of Abraham's family, Abraham and then all his relatives.
Yeah.
Is that Bible?
Yeah, I think so, because I think we don't know for sure if Abraham is the chosen one, or if God kind of proposed some of these things to his father or those before him and they were like, no thanks. But the significance about Abraham is his obedience.
Yeah.
Regardless of whatever other situation was going on that we don't know about, the marking characteristic of Abraham is his obedience and his character and the way that he allows God to shape his character. Which I think is even present in this story, because I think that's what he's trying to protect by saying, Isaac can't marry within the Canaanites, and he can't go back to the land that the ancestors of. But he's trying to protect this line and this character shaping that's happening, that God has kind of started through Abraham. Like, he's trying to protect that, and I think that even with Rebecca, like she's pretty great. She's immediately serving, and it says that she quickly went to give water to the servant and to the camels. She was purposeful about her task, which Dennis Prager draws the connection of even back to, that's a similar thing to Abraham, like when who we understand to be Yeshua and the two angels come, the who ate lunch with Abraham story. Before Sodom and Gomorrah, that he quickly went and got them something to eat. He quickly went and he was quick to serve his guests. That she seems to carry some of that character as well, and that she cares about the animals, so that she's portraying some of these positive character traits that would be in line with, which I think is even why the servants kind of litmus test for who this person is going to be has to do with service, has to do with how she treats a stranger. Yes. Yes. And so it seems that Rebecca has some really great, it seems like she's pretty great, really. Because she's treating, the stranger well, she's serving the stranger, she's doing it, seems to be pretty happy, very kind and not like, oh, I guess I'll go to all this work for you. She's offering, and she's taking care of the camels, and she cares about all these things. Okay, so then ultimately, after this whole thing, they agree that Rebecca can go, and the servant lavishes lots of gifts on the family. But But Rebecca's mother is not quite as quick to want to let her go, and asks for her to be able to stay for a little while. But the servant's like, no, we have to, this is Adonai's work, I have to be able to go. But then they call, and that's when they ask her, and she says that she'll go. And so what's interesting then is as she's kind of sent off, her family is blessing her. And the blessing that her family gives to her is, our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, may your seed possess the gate of those who hate him. Interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't know that they know this all of this covenant. I don't think they probably do. I don't think they quite understand the promise and covenant about seed and land. And even, to me, the seed possess the gate of those who hate him even makes me think back to Genesis 3. Her seed will crush the serpent. Maybe that's a stretch, but that's where my mind goes when I read some of that. But it's so interesting that they're blessing her to have, they're blessing her seed basically, without really knowing that who she's going to marry is the one in this covenantal line, and so that's pretty remarkable.
It does make you wonder if it was traditional, because what we know of Laban later, and even his daughter stealing his idols, this was not like this pious man who worshipped Adonai by any means.
Right.
So even though, they may have known the Genesis, they may have known the Noah blessings, but it made me wonder, like, if this was a standard blessing that they gave over women.
Yeah.
But yeah, the fact that the seed is mentioned and
I think probably something like this was normal, because again, going back to ancient culture, having children is very important. Sons in particular.
Yeah.
A woman with no sons is a little bit hard off, and a woman with no children even more so. And so I think it's probably that some aspect or some kind of blessing unto having children is probably somewhat common. But this specific one and how it ties so closely to the covenant is very interesting. Yes.
The fact he says, may your descendants possess the cities of those who hate them, he's like prophesying into, and probably didn't know really the fullness. We don't know what he knew and how it went, and Abraham, but it's interesting because how many times in the scriptures do we find people speaking the mind of the Lord, and their character isn't really all the best, like Balaam and some of these other people even later. When the Lord wants his word known, he's going to speak it through whomever he's going to choose or whatever.
Yeah.
And also, some of them, throughout this whole parasha, it seems like it's almost like they're being led by the Lord sometimes to make these decisions about going and picking a son, even though they're not saying that.
Right.
So discernment. Maybe,
Right, and I think it goes with this back to this relationship of God with His people, because I think this is very much, they're still very much in the sense of like they have this allegiance to God, but they're still learning what that means. It's like this progressive revelation. It's like God calls Abraham, and God kind of identifies himself with Abraham and his line, but they're still learning what that means to interact with Adonai and with him, and what it means to be led by him. And so I think in some ways, God is really kind. He's like, here, I'm gonna set this up for you, and you might not really know that that's what I'm doing, but
they had to have some inkling of some discernment.
Yes.
And this is God's big plan. Like, this is who's gonna marry who, and this is how it's gonna all fall out. They don't understand all that.
Right.
But they've got a little discernment to operate with him.
Right, because even the level of discernment for Abraham to know Isaac's wife cannot be from the Canaanites, and just to even lay all that out, we don't have this record of, and God said to Abraham, do this for your son.
Some of it was cultural, but there's discernment in here. I just see that playing.
No, I think you're right. I think that's really good. I think
It seems
that's
like there's the operation of the ruach.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Because even, you know, even like we mentioned, like Abraham says that the angel's going to go, that God's going to send an angel before the serpent, but then we don't see the angel mentioned, but clearly things worked out like they were
Yeah.
supposed to.
Yeah.
So it seems,
Line setup.
yeah, you know, it seems that there's something going on here that we're not having all the details about, and that maybe they're not noticing because, again, they're still learning
Yeah.
this relationship and building discernment. But it seems that things are going better than they might if God were not involved. Okay, so basically, yeah. So Rebecca comes back, falls off her camel when she sees Isaac. Which is interesting, Isaac. I just think it's really funny. I think it's really funny that it's in here. It's like, I don't know that I just think it's funny. I just like really enjoy that. I'm sorry. But again, back to, you know, we don't know for sure exactly what Isaac thought about this whole situation, but he's just kind of strolling through the fields, and he comes, and it just says that he sees camels coming, but he doesn't necessarily see her, and he doesn't seem terribly excited about it. And then she, you know, but she sees him.
She had a little anticipation going, probably.
Yeah. And so then, you know, but then they recount to this, and then, yes, like kind of we talked about the very end of this earlier, that Isaac brings her into his mother's tent and took her as his wife and loves her and was comforted in the loss of his mother.
Don't you find it interesting that the mother's tent is still up?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I don't know that we know. We don't have. We could probably make some guesses. We don't have the time between her dying and when it all happens. We don't know how much time has passed. But today, I mean, the grieving period in Jewish life is a year.
Yeah.
So if it's within a year, they probably would have left it. Because it would have, I mean, if that tradition goes back that far, I don't know. But all that to say, grief is a very significant thing in Jewish culture, even going back to this. And so I think, and just because I think, like we're seeing Sarah was such an honored, respected woman, that I think it is interesting that her tent is still there. But I think it adds to that, and it speaks to even honoring some of her if they kind of left her.
Well, with culture-wise, since it sounds like, you know, Sarah had a separate tent from Abraham, would it have made sense that then Isaac's wife, a tent, a place should be prepared for her? And so they left that up? I mean,
Yeah, possibly.
like an inheritance type of thing?
It could be. Yeah, I think that's possible too, because it's interesting the language even of just, you know, that kind of the role that Rebecca fills is comforting him in the loss of his mother. Like that's not always how the role of a wife is framed.
Exactly.
And so it's very interesting. So there's clearly there's some other things going on here that we can kind of guess about, but which is fine. But we don't really know, but we do know that there is a significance to Rebecca coming and kind of taking that place. And so even taking over kind of Sarah's tent, I think is a part of that, you know. And again, she's a woman, you know, Rebecca's this woman of strong character, and so she's kind of the one who is able to kind of take Sarah's place in some sense in the line here. Okay, so we just have a couple minutes left, and I just want to make a couple of points because I think this is really interesting, and I think it's helpful for us as we continue to think about how we deal with the whole existence of Ishmael and those kinds of things. So, chapter 25, the first half of chapter 25 is the end of this portion. And this is this ends up being the end of Abraham's life. So part of this is probably out of order chronologically, because because of the sheer age, it's very unlikely that Abraham took another wife and had all of these other children after Sarah died. This probably happened somewhere along the way, which we talked about. It's very common to have multiple wives at this time, so that's not really the big concern. But here's an interesting thing, couple of interesting things about this, this genealogy. So Abraham marries Katura. One of her sons, I don't know that I had fully realized this until I was reading back through this and reading some commentaries.
Oh.
One of her sons is Midian. Who came from Midian?
Midianites.
Uh-huh. Is
Moses'
Moses' wife.
Moses' father-in-law.
Father-in-law.
He was a priest.
He was a priest of Midian.
Yeah.
So Jethro, yes, is in the line of Abraham through Katura, which is very interesting because then he becomes Moses' father-in-law. And so then even thinking through that, so if you think about that, then the Levites, so Moses and Aaron were Christ, the high priest comes through Aaron, but the rest of the family is still Levite, right? So the rest of the Levites, so the Levites really are the Levites descended from Moses are descended from Abraham through both Sarah and Katura.
Right.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that's cool. That's
It's
really
just such
cool.
an interesting tie to the genealogy. I don't know that I had fully taken the time to stop and look at that genealogy before to see even the significance of that line of Midian, because Jethro, of course, is very important to Moses. He really helps Moses out. Even though he wasn't a fully righteous person, he still is a significant character and there's a portion named after him.
He had a lot of wisdom.
He had a lot of wisdom, and he plays an important role, and he really, he's significant in the story of Moses. And so it's interesting to look back and see even how, God kind of set this up through these other children. And then just kind of a final point. So in Genesis 25:7, now these are the days of the years of Abraham's life that he lived. So he lived 175 years, so he did live a good bit after Sarah. So Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, old and satisfied. Some translations say contented. He's kind of he and Abraham and Isaac are the only two who had said that they died satisfied or content. Everyone else dies with some angst. Even thinking about Moses, Moses kind of dies in his frustration of not being able to enter the land, but Abraham and Isaac both die having lived full, happy, satisfied. It says that they're satisfied in their old age, which is kind of cool. And then it says, and then he was gathered to his people. And then Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, next to Mamre, the field that Abraham brought from the sons of Heth. There Abraham is buried along with Sarah, his wife. So Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham together. So either, we don't know about what their relationship was like at this point, so either they kind of come together and get along to bury their father, or they have a fine relationship. We don't have really a record of there really being a rift. Of course, they have separate callings, they have separate, kind of assigned separate land, those kinds of things. But at this point, Isaac and Ishmael, we don't have any evidence that they have a troubled relationship. And remember, Ishmael was circumcised as well. Ishmael's part of the Abrahamic Covenant, which we have, of course, his descendants eventually become very unrighteous, and there's a lot of issues. But at this point, Ishmael himself does not seem to be the enemy that I think, because of the rest of history, we tend to think it that way. So, but I think it's helpful for us as we look, because of course we want the reconciliation of God's family, to see that it was not always so difficult and it was not always so tense. That's what we're looking toward. That's where our hope is that there would be reconciliation back to brothers loving one another, same father, all those kinds of things. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, that we do have more of a positive light of Ishmael at this particular moment, even if it's only for a moment.
Yeah.
So anyway, so it is the end. Any final comments? So again, I think there's some blessing. I think we started out saying we were kind of seeing the three components of the Abrahamic Covenant kind of progressing forward a little bit. So we saw the land with purchasing the cave, and also the significance of Isaac staying in the land. And then of course the seed with going and getting Rebecca as Isaac's wife. And then I think we just even we see the blessing of even the wealth that that Abraham has accumulated, and also just the way that people deal with him. I think there's the fact that Laban and his family, even though it seems that they're more concerned about wealth than about God, but they still receive the servant well, and they interact well. And so there's, it's that those who bless you will be blessed, and curse you will be cursed. They're certainly not cursing Abraham and his family, and so there seems to be some blessing, and they of course gain some significant wealth in this marriage setup with Rebecca. And so I just was kind of seeing that pattern that this covenant is being pushed forward as the narrative continues. And of course will continue to be, because we talked about a couple weeks ago, this Abrahamic Covenant is foundational under even the Mosaic Covenant. Like the unconditional nature of the Abrahamic Covenant is very significant, and I think going back and seeing the story grounded in that covenant will help us as we continue to see kind of the narrative push forward, and how God continues to work through his chosen people and the development of Israel and all those things. All right. Cool. So let me pray real quick and we'll be done. So Lord, we thank you again. We thank you for Shabbat, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity to come and study your word, to see your faithfulness to your covenant, Lord, to see how you work and how you interact with people, Lord. I ask that you would just be present with us in service, Lord. I ask that you would prepare our hearts as we prepare to take the table of the Lord, that you would just come and meet with us as we do that, Lord. And we just thank you, Lord, that we get to worship together and in your presence, and that we get to just enjoy that fellowship, Lord. B'Shem Yeshua.